power is a dangerous thing, especially when it is guarded by a mother willing to sacrifice everything, even her own child, to keep it. Imagine corridors filled with whispered threats, chambers where loyalty is measured in fear, and a throne that demands blood to remain secure. Behind gilded walls and ceremonial splendor lies a story of ambition, so ruthless it twists family bonds into instruments of control. Every smile hides a calculation, every gesture conceals a threat, and every decision carries consequences no one is prepared to face. In this tale, the line between protector and predator blurs, and the price of power is revealed not in battles won, but in the hearts shattered along the way. Step into a world where the crown itself casts the longest shadows, and survival is never guaranteed. Picture this. You are a palace guard in the heart of medieval Europe, standing under the flickering torchlight of stone corridors so cold that even your armor seems to shiver. The year is 1457, and whispers carry faster than swords. Tonight, the queen moves through her private chambers like a shadow, draped in velvet darker than grief itself, her hands always brushing against the dagger hidden beneath her skirts. Every servant, every attendant has learned to keep their eyes lowered, for even accidental eye contact could be read as disloyalty, and disloyalty is a crime with a blade attached. The throne she inherited was not given freely, nor did she inherit it peacefully. She climbed it on the backs of men who underestimated her cunning and survived the subtle poisonings, quiet assassinations, and political betrayals that had felled even her closest allies. Now, sitting behind closed doors, she contemplates a decision that will define her reign forever, an act so ruthless that even the histories will struggle to record it without flinching. Her son, the prince, sleeps upstairs, unaware that his next breath may be the last granted by maternal mercy. To outsiders, she is a devoted mother, a figure draped in mourning for her late husband, her eyes always downcast in ceremonial grief. But you, standing in the shadows, have seen the truth. Love has never guided her hand. Ambition has. Survival has. Power has. And power, as she has learned in every whispered council meeting and every blood-stained negotiation, demands sacrifices that even nature would recoil from acknowledging. She runs her fingers across the crown, the gold warm from the fires of the forge, but heavier than any iron she has lifted in her life. Every jewel seems to pulse with judgment, every spike a reminder that crowns are not for the faint of heart. They are ornaments, yes, but more importantly, they are weapons capable of cutting even those who wear them. The court has learned not to question her. Nobles smile, bow, and whisper flattery. But in their eyes, you can see fear, and rightly so. For centuries, the throne had devoured rulers who underestimated it, and this queen has studied every one of their mistakes. She knows the histories. She knows that mercy is often a prelude to betrayal, that indulgence breeds rebellion, that hesitation is a luxury afforded only to the dead. Her advisors, those few who remain alive, huddle in corners, quietly debating which lies to offer today, which rumors to spread to protect themselves. But none dare to advise against her. No one dares suggest restraint, for the consequence is not only death, it is erasure. Stories of disloyal courtiers vanish as if they had never existed, leaving only the faintest trace in the memory of terrified witnesses. Tonight, her son sleeps unaware, but the queen does not. She recalls the treacherous whispers of her enemies, the plots hatched behind her back, the alliances that could topple her in a single night. Each memory sharpens the edge of her resolve. A mother's heart would break at the thought of spilling her own child's blood, but she is not merely a mother. She is the keeper of the throne, and the throne demands absolutes. She imagines the court's reaction when the deed is done, stunned silence, followed by a trembling obedience, a recognition that the price of power is the price of life itself. She has weighed it, measured it, and accepted it. The path forward is soaked in the inevitability of blood. Outside, the castle walls groan under the wind. The torches flicker, shadows bend unnaturally, as though the night itself recoils from what is about to happen. Every step the queen takes toward her son's chamber echoes in the stone halls, like the tolling of a bell announcing doom. She enters quietly, the dagger glinting faintly in her hand, reflecting her own eyes, eyes that have long forgotten fear, eyes that have learned that love and ambition are often incompatible. This night, history will record the act, though perhaps not with all the horror it deserves. Tonight, she will choose the throne over blood, survival over affection, and the echo of her choice will ripple through time, haunting every generation that dares remember. The crown of blood waits, heavy and inevitable. The prince grows in silence, a boy shadowed by a crown that seems to hover over him even before he can understand its weight. In the golden halls of the palace, he walks like a ghost, his steps echoing against walls carved with the stories of ancestors who, like him, were meant for power, but unlike him, did not survive its cost. His mother watches from behind curtains, eyes narrowed, calculating. She observes every twitch of his hand, every flicker of expression, every innocent rebellion that could one day challenge her authority. To her, the boy is both heir and threat, his existence a constant reminder that the throne she fought for could one day slip from her grasp, and she knows with a precision sharpened by years of intrigue that shadows can conceal far more than they reveal. Every lesson the boy receives is a lesson in fear as much as knowledge. Tutors speak softly of history, philosophy, warfare, but in the background, the queen teaches subtler things: the necessity of cruelty, the power of perception, the art of preemptive strike. She whispers to advisors, "Never let the son forget who reigns." Servants, too, play their part, reporting his tantrums, cataloging missteps, ensuring that even the smallest act of defiance is noted. It is a palace governed as much by shadow as by law. The prince, growing in this web, begins to understand that every smile, every complaint, every request is weighed against invisible scales. Innocence, he learns too early, is a liability. Trust, a dangerous indulgence. Love, a trap. Yet there are moments when he tests boundaries. Small rebellions, a refusal to eat, a defiant glance, a stolen word whispered to a companion, reveal a boy who is aware, subtly, of the chains around him. Each act is observed, noted, and weighed. The queen's presence is inescapable. Even in his dreams, she intrudes, a figure of admiration, terror, and inevitability. She does not strike openly, not yet. Punishments are indirect, carefully measured. A servant dismissed for failing to obey his whims, a favorite toy removed, whispers of disapproval murmured into corridors where he cannot help but hear. It is the architecture of domination, a network of subtle pressures designed to shape, constrain, and ultimately command loyalty, not through love, but through fear. Courtiers whisper behind locked doors about the boy's temper. Some joke nervously that he will be worse than his mother. Others wonder if he is already learning to manipulate those around him. If his shadowed childhood is crafting a monster even she cannot control. And she watches, patient, because shadows, like kings, are only dangerous if underestimated. She has seen other heirs falter, blind to the currents that dictate survival at court, and she has sworn that this will not be her mistake. The boy is trained, yes, but also tested, like steel forged by fire, hammered into obedience. In her mind, the throne and the sun are entwined in a delicate calculus. Keep him alive, but never let him gain confidence too soon. One evening, she observes him in the gardens, moonlight tracing his small form as he chases rabbits and swats at the night air, laughter echoing faintly among the hedges. The image should be tender. Instead, she sees opportunity and risk intermingled. Tomorrow, the same child will sit at lessons on governance, on diplomacy, on the arts of war, and she will measure silently how well he absorbs them. His successes will be noted, his failures catalogued. Every glance toward independence, every flicker of rebellion, will remind her that shadows do not always bow willingly. Some, eventually, step into the light, and when they do, the queen knows the world may tremble. The sun's shadow stretches long across palace floors, brushing against walls lined with ancestral portraits. Each painting seems to judge him, and perhaps, in quiet hours, it does. For the boy is learning early that history is less about memory than manipulation, that every story told, every record kept, can be bent to serve survival. And the queen, watching from her hidden vantage, sees the beginnings of understanding in his eyes. It is thrilling. It is terrifying. Most of all, it is dangerous. Because shadows, unlike light, can hide truths no one dares acknowledge. And soon, the boy may learn exactly how to use his own. The palace is a living organism of whispers, half-truths, and carefully measured loyalty. Each corridor a vein through which fear flows as easily as the servants' water buckets. Every advisor, every tutor, every minor lord, with ambition brimming behind courteous bows, carries a blade in words and intentions. The queen knows this. She has learned it over years of watching rivals fall to invisible traps. Their own confidence is exploited until they are hollowed shells. Counsel is never pure, never honest. Every conversation a duel in which the boy's future hangs by a hair, and her crown teeters with each misstep. Here, in these gilded halls, loyalty is always temporary, and survival is always purchased with vigilance, cunning, and, when necessary, ruthlessness. The queen has trained the boy to notice the smallest things: a hesitant glance, a twitch of a finger, a stammer in response to a question. She whispers that the court is a living threat, that even friendly faces can hide daggers sharper than steel. Advisors who appear devoted are often those most skilled at feigning obedience. Some whisper poisonous counsel in the boy's ear under the guise of education, hinting that their loyalty lies not with the crown, but with opportunity, ambition, or greed. The queen allows this. She wants him to learn that power is never gifted, that influence is not inherited, and that every smile hides teeth capable of tearing more than flesh. They can devour legacy, reputation, even life itself. Courtiers themselves thrive on the fear they spread. Some are subtle manipulators, planting seeds of doubt in the boy's mind about friends and enemies alike. Others are overtly cunning, weaving intricate webs of flattery and threat around the queen, hoping she will falter, that one misstep will cost her her throne. Every interaction becomes a performance, every compliment a calculated move. The boy watches. He learns quickly that listening can save life, that silence can be both shield and weapon, that the line between counsel and betrayal is as thin as a dagger's edge. And in those moments, the queen smiles privately, seeing the beginnings of a ruler who understands not just obedience, but anticipation, not just knowledge, but manipulation. Yet the poison is not only in words, it permeates ritual and custom. Diplomats arrive with gifts wrapped in subtext, treaties drafted with subtle clauses designed to ensnare. Even servants speak in code, their reports shaped to please and mislead simultaneously. The queen navigates this labyrinth like a serpent, always sensing currents others fail to perceive. She knows that one misjudged syllable could awaken the ambition she has spent decades tempering, and that one mismanaged ally could spark rebellion. So she measures every instruction, every encouragement, every act of discipline with the precision of a surgeon. The boy sees this, learns it, and internalizes it. His understanding of courtly poison will one day rival her own. The most dangerous counsel is rarely direct. It arrives cloaked in flattery, spoken in hushed tones during moments when the queen's attention is elsewhere. Advisors hint at plots, invent threats, exaggerate rivalries. Some offer solutions that seem beneficial, but mask subtle traps, creating dependency, sowing mistrust. The queen observes from the shadows, smiling faintly, for she knows that those who survive her court do so by learning the art of suspicion. And suspicion, in her world, is both shield and weapon, allowing the boy to navigate treacherous waters while simultaneously understanding that fear itself is a tool to be wielded. Even the boy's own reflection becomes counsel, as he begins to see shadows where others see light, to anticipate deception before it arrives, to weigh each decision not by morality, but by survival. By the time he reaches adolescence, the lessons are ingrained. almost instinctive. Every whisper is evaluated, every suggestion scrutinized, every smile suspected. And the queen watches, calculating the moment when he will be ready, not just to inherit the throne, but to wield the very poison of counsel as both shield and sword. Because in a court steeped in deception, where loyalty is as fleeting as breath, only those who understand the true nature of poison counsel can survive, and only those willing to become venom themselves can ever rule unchallenged. The throne waits. It waits in silence, a gilded specter looming over every whispered conversation, every bowed head, every calculation made behind the velvet curtains of the royal court. To the untrained eye, it is merely an object of power, a symbol of authority, carved and encrusted with gold, gemstones, and sacred insignias. To those who understand its weight, it is a living presence, a predator that measures ambition, loyalty, and weakness alike. Every footstep within the palace echoes its unspoken judgment, and every breath drawn in its shadow carries the risk of miscalculation. The queen knows this better than anyone, and she has spent years teaching her son the dangerous truth. The throne is not a reward, it is a trap. The boy feels the pull of destiny even before he touches the ceremonial chair. He senses the currents of expectation running through the palace corridors, the invisible strings that stretch from ministers to soldiers, from courtiers to servants. All eyes are on him, not in admiration, but in calculation. Each glance is a wager, each smile a bet on whether he will rise or falter. He watches the seasoned courtiers, their hands twitching over scrolls and ledgers, their tongues ready to twist truth into advantage. He begins to understand, with that instinctive clarity only youth sharpened by fear can provide, that the throne is less a seat of honor than a stage for survival, a spotlight under which enemies and allies alike reveal themselves. The queen's presence amplifies the danger. She walks beside him, a shadow with teeth, her eyes never missing a detail. Her lessons are subtle, delivered in tone and gaze rather than instruction. She allows him to witness betrayal disguised as advice, ambition dressed as loyalty, whispers of dissent masked as concern. From her, he learns the art of patience, the value of timing, and the terror inherent in overconfidence. She does not merely prepare him to sit upon the throne, she prepares him to command it, to bend the palace's treacherous ecosystem to his will, to recognize the venom before it strikes. Every decision is a rehearsal for the inevitable confrontation between authority and subversion. Yet the throne is more than political machinery. It is a symbol of fear, an anchor for imagination and obsession. Courtiers speak of its history in hushed tones, recounting the blood spilled over its possession, the conspiracies hatched and failed within its shadow, the rulers undone by the weight of their own ambition. The boy listens, fascinated and horrified in equal measure, realizing that the stories are warnings and invitations simultaneously. The throne promises immortality and delivers scrutiny, grants authority, and extracts terror. To claim it is to embrace responsibility, yes, but also to accept that each breath taken under its shadow will be weighed, measured, and judged, often by those who will never hesitate to strike. Preparations intensify as the moment draws near. Advisors draft proclamations, armies muster in silent obedience, and rituals are rehearsed with precision that borders on obsession. The boy observes every nuance, the careful arrangement of banners, the subtle alignment of courtiers, the choreography of power that ensures loyalty and masks menace. He sees the throne as it is, not as a reward, but as a crucible, and the queen, watching him, recognizes the gleam in his eye. He understands now that the throne is both target and weapon, a seat from which survival is dictated not merely by intelligence, but by ruthlessness, calculation, and the capacity to instill fear as effortlessly as one breathes. In these days before coronation, the palace becomes a theater of tension. Every whisper carries weight, every gesture hides intent. Servants pass cautiously, afraid to attract attention. Guards stand rigid, each movement scrutinized. Advisors speak only when certain of advantage. The boy moves among them, like a predator learning the terrain, noting weakness, memorizing patterns, and internalizing the silent language of power. The throne looms, not just in the ceremonial hall, but in every glance exchanged, in every silent threat carried on the wind. It waits, patient, inevitable, and insatiable. And when at last the day arrives, the throne will no longer be a distant shadow, it will be his. But he knows, as the queen has taught him, that the true struggle begins not upon sitting, but in commanding, surviving, and bending all who dare to oppose him. The looming throne is not a promise. It is a warning, a crucible, and a mirror that will reflect the depth of his ambition and the sharpness of his cruelty. Those who underestimate it do so at their peril, and those who overestimate it will find that power, once grasped, is never relinquished lightly. The queen's smile was a weapon. It warmed the hall with the illusion of benevolence. But beneath it lay a cold, deliberate calculation that struck fear into the hearts of those who knew her true nature. Her elegance, her silks, the jewels that seemed to sparkle with every gesture, all of it was theater. Every step she took, every word she spoke, was designed to manipulate, to command obedience without appearing to do so. Courtiers praised her wisdom, envoys trusted her diplomacy, and generals admired her cunning. Yet few could see the shadow lurking beneath her charm, a mother whose love was inseparable from ambition, whose guidance concealed lessons in deception, cruelty, and control. From the moment her son was born, he was both a precious heir and a tool for power. She nurtured him, yes, but with precision, as though raising a weapon rather than a child. Affection was carefully measured. Indulgence, strategically administered. She combined warmth and fear in ways subtle enough to be invisible to outsiders, yet potent enough to shape a boy's instincts before he could even speak in full sentences. Every lesson, every gentle word, carried hidden intent. Every reward was conditional, every punishment, a test of his obedience and comprehension of courtly calculation. The palace itself became her stage, and everyone within it a player. Servants, ministers, advisors, all were ensnared in her invisible web. Letters carried loyalty, alliances were forged and broken with quiet precision, and rumors spread like venom through the corridors, each one carefully timed to destabilize or manipulate. Her manipulation extended outward as meticulously as it reached inward, crafting the illusion of a harmonious court, while secretly eroding trust, stoking fear, and ensuring that no one could act independently. Her son observed it all. He watched as she turned ministers' ambitions against one another, how she deployed charm and intimidation interchangeably, and how a single glance could shift the outcome of a meeting. The queen demonstrated that power was not wielded solely through force, but through perception, through subtlety, through the art of convincing others to do what they never realized they were being coerced to do. He absorbed her lessons in silence, his young mind recording every manipulation, every strategic smile, every feigned display of generosity that masked cruelty or leverage. Yet her most chilling deception was reserved for him. She cultivated dependence and loyalty, while secretly teaching him the hardest lesson of all: the cost of power might be someone he loved. Encouragement contained hidden demands. Praise carried expectations he could scarcely articulate. Corrections were tests disguised as guidance. By the time he would ascend to power, he would know instinctively that love could be traded for obedience, that trust could be weaponized, and that survival often required sacrificing the innocent, including family. Outside observers saw harmony, a devoted mother, a gifted heir, a court under steady, enlightened leadership. Inside, the palace throbbed with tension, with careful calculations, with unseen threats. Every interaction between mother and son, every whispered counsel in private chambers, was a lesson in manipulation and control, shaping him into someone capable of wielding not just a crown, but fear, deception, and authority with precision. Through it all, she taught him the most important skill of all. Appearances could be weaponized, loyalty could be bought, fear cultivated, obedience extracted with a glance. By the time he would sit upon the throne, he would inherit a kingdom, but also the cold, deliberate mastery of deception, honed by the very person who had given him life. In her hands, the boy became not merely an heir, but a disciple of her craft, prepared to continue the legacy of cunning, manipulation, and ruthless ambition that defined her reign. In the shadows of her lessons, the boy's innocence was gradually replaced by understanding. He would come to see the palace as a world of mirrors, where reflection and reality were not the same, where every smile, gesture, and word carried layers of meaning designed to test, teach, and control. And when the moment arrived that he would inherit the throne, he would already know the most terrifying truth. To survive, to rule, and to triumph, he would sometimes have to betray the very blood that ran through his veins. When the boy finally touched the crown, it was heavier than anyone could have imagined, not because of gold or jewels, but because of the burdens woven into its very existence. Every gem seemed to carry whispers of betrayal, every engraving told of treachery, and every inch of its metalwork pressed not on the head alone, but on the mind, the soul, the fragile threads of morality that had survived the court's manipulations. Those who had worn it before had learned quickly. Crowns were never mere ornaments. They were instruments of control, instruments of expectation, instruments of death. And now, it was his turn. The court watched silently, some with awe, others with fear. They had trained their eyes on the boy since infancy, memorizing the curve of his smile, the tilt of his head, the cold glimmer in his gaze. They believed they were witnesses to triumph, to the culmination of lineage and destiny. Few realized they were seeing the first act of a performance that would terrify generations. The crown, resting on his head, did more than signify kingship. It became a symbol of unyielding power, of unspoken demands, and of the inevitable cost of disobedience. From the beginning, the weight of rulership was revealed in subtle, painful ways. Courtiers were quick to notice his impatience with delays, his disdain for the incompetent, and the precision with which he measured human behavior. Every decision carried consequences far beyond expectation. When a minister faltered, when a general hesitated, the boy observed with an intensity that was almost physical, a silent scrutiny that left his subjects shivering. The crown amplified his authority, making indecision dangerous, mistakes lethal, and loyalty a fragile commodity. He learned immediately that power was not abstract. It was corporeal, physical, and constant. The throne demanded presence, demanded attention, demanded awareness of every corner of the palace, every whisper in the halls, every glance exchanged among servants. He discovered that even the smallest inaction, a delayed order, or a misinterpreted message, could unravel weeks of strategy. The crown required vigilance, and its demands never paused for hunger, fatigue, or doubt. It exacted obedience not only from others, but from the wearer, forcing him into a perpetual state of calculation, suspicion, and preparation. The queen, watching from her hidden gallery, understood the lesson perfectly. She had prepared him for this weight, molding him into someone who could absorb the crown's burdens without crumbling. Her previous deceptions, her manipulations, her deliberate exposure to fear, betrayal, and observation had not been cruelty for its own sake. They were calibration. Every humiliation endured, every loyalty tested, every family secret uncovered, had been a rehearsal for the crown's relentless demand. The boy now understood, finally, that love and power were not separate forces. They were intertwined, and mastery of one required ruthless understanding of the other. But understanding did not lessen the crown's toll. Nights became restless, haunted by the knowledge that every action carried potential devastation. Advisors who had once seemed innocuous now appeared as threats. Allies became calculations. Even family members were measured in degrees of utility and risk. The throne transformed the palace into a landscape of constant assessment, where comfort was an illusion and control a continuous necessity. Nothing could be trusted, and yet everything had to be commanded. Even with this clarity, the boy began to sense that the crown demanded more than obedience from him. It demanded transformation. The once innocent curiosity in his eyes hardened into calculation. The playful manipulations of youth sharpened into strategies that could bend humans to his will, and the shadow of the Queen's teachings expanded, feeding into the developing realization that mercy, compromise, and affection were luxuries for the powerless. The crown heavy on his head reshaped his mind, carving out room for ambition, cruelty, and calculated domination. By the first week of his rule, the boy understood fully. A ruler was not merely a figurehead, not a ceremonial presence, but a constant force, a relentless authority that reached into every decision, every heart, every secret. The crown did not merely rest on him, it became him, inseparable from his thoughts, inseparable from his will, inseparable from the meticulous cruelty he had already begun to practice. To wear it was to carry history, expectation, and terror, all balanced precariously on the narrow bridge between adolescence and absolute power, and he walked it with deliberate, terrifying purpose. Power, the boy quickly learned, was less about authority and more about anticipation. By the time he had fully adjusted to the crown, he understood that threats did not always announce themselves. They slithered quietly, waiting for a moment of weakness. The court, accustomed to centuries of traditional rule, believed themselves clever, believing that wealth, influence, and alliances could shield them from the dangers of youthful kingship. They were wrong. Every whisper, every glance, every hesitant gesture became fodder for calculation. The boy's mind, sharpened by the Queen's relentless instruction, began weaving unseen webs, designing traps invisible to all but him. It began with small provocations. A minister delayed a decree, a general questioned an order, a noblewoman subtly undermined an official gathering. The boy observed in silence, taking notes in memory, recording patterns of fear, ambition, and greed. He noticed how a slight hesitation could reveal the limits of loyalty, how whispered alliances could be anticipated, and how human desire, unchecked, could become a weapon. Each observation, cataloged and stored, became a component of a larger design, an intricate network intended to ensure that no action would escape consequence, no betrayal would go unnoticed, and no adversary would ever strike first without paying a meticulous price. By the end of the first month, the traps were no longer theoretical. Courtiers who had grown complacent now found themselves subtly ensnared. Invitations to private audiences carried hidden expectations. Favors were given with silent strings attached. Every interaction was layered with peril. The boy's instructions to servants, often appearing innocuous or ceremonial, were carefully constructed to test obedience and reveal secrets. Those who faltered, even slightly, were quietly marked. Nothing happened immediately. Punishments were deliberate, calculated, and cruel, designed to teach lessons to both the guilty and the observant. The palace became a living laboratory of psychological manipulation, and the boy its meticulous architect. The Queen, ever present behind her mask of composure, watched with satisfaction. Her son had learned that threats were not always shouted or obvious. They were woven, quiet, and patient, growing stronger as the unsuspecting approached them. She had orchestrated this understanding over years of subtle instruction, allowing him to observe the consequences of ambition, pride, and ignorance firsthand. Now, the boy was executing her final lesson. Power was maintained not just through force, but through cunning, patience, and a relentless ability to exploit the weaknesses of others. The first trap, small in appearance, but lethal in effect, involved a prominent general, whose loyalty had always been tenuous. The boy invited him to a ceremonial review of troops, suggesting that a routine inspection would honor his service. In reality, the inspection had been designed with hidden obstacles, subtle signals, and controlled witnesses. Every hesitation, every error, every misstep would be reported not to punish rashly, but to expose vulnerability and create leverage. The general stumbled once, almost imperceptibly, and the boy noted it, quietly sharing the observation with selected confidants. Within hours, the court's perception of the general's reliability shifted. Whispers circulated, doubts were sown, and the trap had claimed its first silent victory. By the time the court realized what had happened, The boy's network of surveillance, manipulation, and calculated testing was complete. Nobles who once believed themselves untouchable began second-guessing every action, every word. Subtle examinations, impossible coincidences, and whispered insinuations became evidence in an invisible trial where the boy himself was judge, jury, and executioner. Even the most cautious courtiers were forced to navigate a minefield of expectations they could not fully understand. It was clear now to anyone observing with clarity that the boy had transformed the court into a machine, one whose gears were fear, observation, and cunning. Every action fed into his understanding of human behavior, and every reaction strengthened his dominion. The traps were set, intricate and inescapable, and the boy waited patiently for those who underestimated him to step forward. In the shadows of opulence and ceremony, the seeds of betrayal and downfall had been sown by the smallest, most deliberate hands. By the week's end, the message had been delivered to the entire court without a single sword drawn. Obedience was not optional, and every misstep would be anticipated, dissected, and exploited. The boy king, standing beneath the weight of the crown, had proven that he understood its true purpose, not merely to sit upon, but to wield as a weapon. And in the palace's gilded halls, the first tremors of terror rippled through the nobles, who had once thought themselves untouchable. Even in the midst of power, even surrounded by fear and submission, the human heart remains dangerously unpredictable. The boy king had mastered strategy, intimidation, and observation. Yet he was not immune to the subtleties of emotion, not his own, certainly, but those of others. Courtiers began to reveal cracks in loyalty, not out of ambition or malice, but because the queen's shadow loomed over their conscience. They admired the boy's cunning, feared his ruthlessness, yet could not fully extinguish the remnants of compassion. It was in these spaces, the liminal gaps between fear and desire, that the most dangerous currents of influence began to flow. The queen herself watched, her hands folded in the ceremonial folds of her gown, as she observed both her son and those who served him. Her power was absolute yet fragile, reliant not only on threats and manipulation, but on the perception of inevitability. She had orchestrated everything, from the crown's placement upon his young head to the carefully timed traps that ensnared the ambitious. But now, she confronted a complication that even she could not fully control. Her son's cruelty, disciplined and precise as it was, began to stir hesitation in her most loyal allies. They admired his efficiency, yet recoiled at the breadth of his cruelty. Their hearts, conflicted, began to seek compromise where none could exist. It started with the palace guards, those who had trained to obey and protect without question. They observed the boy's ceremonies, the calculated punishments, the subtle tests of loyalty, and yet they felt an unease that gnawed at their resolve. Could they continue to watch suffering inflicted on the innocent, even when obedience demanded it? Could they participate in spectacles that humiliated, tortured, or annihilated without conscience? The answers were not easy, and their uncertainty quickly became a silent tension that pulsed through the corridors like a hidden current of electricity, waiting to ignite. Among the nobles, the same struggle played out in shadows. Families who had previously submitted to the boy's demands began to experience inner conflict. They understood, with chilling clarity, that survival required compliance, but survival came at the cost of conscience. Mothers and fathers argued in private chambers, their voices hushed yet fervent, about how far they could bend before breaking entirely. Would delivering their children to the boy's ceremonies secure their safety, or condemn them to lifelong trauma? Would serving the queen's designs preserve their influence, or forever stain their legacy with complicity? These questions haunted every whispered conversation, every measured gesture, every strategic compromise. Even the boy himself, though far younger than his court, sensed the unease. He was a keen observer of human behavior, and he noticed the hesitation in gestures, the fleeting doubts in eyes, the way loyalty wavered at the edges. These small cracks became tools, opportunities to manipulate, to reinforce his dominance. Yet, they also introduced unpredictability. For the first time, the boy confronted the reality that even fear could be imperfect, and that the human heart, conflicted and inconsistent, could disrupt the most meticulously laid plans. The queen, ever watchful, recognized the significance of these moments. She had taught her son to read people like maps, to anticipate weaknesses before they became threats, and to strike decisively. Yet she knew that hearts divided by morality, affection, or loyalty were volatile instruments, unpredictable and potentially catastrophic. The very subjects whose compliance had cemented her son's early reign could, if swayed by conscience or desperation, become instruments of ruin. She understood that power required not only control over actions, but mastery of hearts. It was in the tension of conflicted hearts that the next stage of the queen's strategy emerged. She began to subtly manipulate these emotions, providing incentives for loyalty, creating consequences for hesitation, and weaving moral dilemmas that would force her subjects to confront their limits. She allowed doubt to exist, knowing it would drive people to overcompensate in their obedience, heightening their vulnerability. The boy's traps, while devastatingly effective, were only part of a larger design, a palace in which every emotion, fear, devotion, guilt, desire, was weaponized. By the end of the chapter, the court had been transformed. The nobles and servants alike operated under the weight of perpetual uncertainty, their hearts pulled in conflicting directions, their minds trapped between survival and conscience. The queen had ensured that every decision, every hesitation, and every emotion served the machinery of control. And in this delicate balance, the boy learned that dominion was not only secured by visible authority, but by mastering the invisible, the currents of the human heart. Words can wound more efficiently than steel. In the palace, whispers carried further than swords, and a single phrase could topple reputations, sever alliances, or bend a mind into submission. The queen understood this better than anyone. She had built her empire not merely through military might or ceremonial displays, but by mastering the subtle art of verbal venom. Every conversation, every letter, every suggestion carried a double edge, one for those who obeyed, and a sharper one for those who dared to hesitate. Poisoned words became instruments of power, invisible yet lethal, shaping loyalty and fear with the precision of a practiced surgeon. Her son, the boy king, absorbed these lessons like a sponge. He watched as courtiers hesitated in speech, careful not to invoke displeasure, careful not to reveal secrets that could be exploited. The queen's methods were exacting. She instructed that praise should be administered sparingly, warnings given subtly, and gossip cultivated like a garden, each rumor selected for maximum damage. Allies could be made or destroyed in a single sentence. And the boy, already cruelly perceptive, learned that words could be sharper than daggers, their effects slower but more enduring, seeping into the minds of men until loyalty became indistinguishable from terror. At first, the boy imitated, mimicking his mother's tone, her cadence, her ability to insinuate, cajole, and manipulate simultaneously. The palace soon buzzed with tension. Courtiers discovered that a compliment could conceal a threat, that a question might hide an accusation, that advice could be laced with danger. Every meeting became a battlefield of nuance, every sentence a weapon. Those who misinterpreted intent risked dismissal, disgrace, or even death. Even the most seasoned advisors began to tremble, realizing that the queen's influence now extended beyond her own voice. Through her son, her legacy of verbal precision was infecting the entire court. The boy's first experiments with poisoned words were subtle but devastating. He praised a young general for courage in battle, then added a casual remark about how courage without obedience was useless, planting seeds of doubt and anxiety. He commended a minister for efficiency, while noting softly that inefficiency could easily be interpreted as treason. He even instructed servants with carefully worded threats, disguised as instructions, ensuring that fear and discipline coexisted in a single interaction. Each utterance was designed to test boundaries, probe loyalties, and expand his dominion without lifting a hand. Outside the walls of the palace, the queen's reach through words extended further. Letters sent to allied nobles contained half-truths, insinuations, and subtle exaggerations designed to provoke suspicion among friends and sow discord among rivals. She whispered to envoys in carefully chosen phrases, manipulating entire regions without ever moving a soldier. Courtiers who misjudged these subtle cues found themselves isolated, losing favor and protection. A single misinterpreted compliment or untimely remark could erase decades of service. The boy observed this, understanding that verbal power was cumulative, like poison in a well, invisible at first, but deadly once it spread. Yet words were double-edged, even for the most cautious. Some courtiers began to anticipate the queen's patterns, learning to parse hidden meanings, to counter insinuations with their own verbal strategies, to twist her intentions back upon themselves. The palace became a maze of mistrust, where every exchange was scrutinized, dissected, and replayed in the minds of those who feared misstep. The queen, recognizing this, encouraged the boy to escalate subtle cruelty into theatrical displays. Public reprimands with hidden implications, private admonishments that whispered disaster for those who dared to misinterpret, creating a climate where fear and ambition were inseparable. By the time the boy fully embraced the art of poisoned words, the palace had transformed into a theater of calculated tension. Loyalty was no longer guaranteed by fear alone. It was maintained by uncertainty, by the relentless doubt that every conversation could harbor a trap, and by the realization that silence might be the only shield from ruin. Every syllable, every intonation, every pause was a weapon in a war of intellect and influence. Poisoned words had become an empire unto themselves, silent, insidious, and irresistible. And the boy, learning from the queen's meticulous craft, began to wield them as deftly as a general commanded armies. Soon, even the most confident courtiers discovered that surviving the palace depended less on obedience and more on interpreting the subtle poison hidden in every interaction. A single misstep could end careers, end lives, and alter the course of history itself. Death, when wielded deliberately, is a tool more precise than any sword, more absolute than any decree. In the queen's court, the executioner was both instrument and message, a living reminder that power was absolute and mercy conditional. Every swing of the axe, every pull of the cord, every sip of poison administered was a lesson in obedience, a performance meant to instill fear in those who dared challenge authority. The queen understood that terror must be tangible. Rumors of her ruthlessness were not enough. She required spectacle. Her son, now growing into a man of terrifying acuity, observed closely, absorbing lessons in the orchestration of death, with a detached curiosity that chilled even the most seasoned palace guards. The first executions were calculated to send whispers through the marble halls, without causing open rebellion. A disloyal advisor caught plotting, a servant who had mismanaged a ceremonial duty, a minor noble who showed hesitation in loyalty. All were selected carefully, their demise choreographed to maximize psychological impact. Each death was a carefully staged event, the condemned's final moments displayed publicly, their expressions recorded in memory as cautionary tales. Silence followed each act, as courtiers contemplated the power of a hand willing to remove life without hesitation. The queen made certain that her son was present, witnessing the inevitability of consequence, learning that authority demanded ruthless consistency. The boy's first directive as co-ruler involved a seemingly minor betrayal. A trusted chamberlain, accused of sending information to a rival noble, was brought forward. The queen allowed her son to oversee the proceedings, giving him subtle guidance on the executioner's timing, the words spoken before the act, and the measured pauses that transformed punishment into lesson. The chamberlain knelt, hands bound, eyes wide with realization that pleading could not alter fate. The queen whispered instructions to her son. Observe fear closely. Notice how obedience can be cultivated through certainty of consequence. When the executioner's hand fell, swift and precise, the boy's expression betrayed something darker than mere comprehension. It was recognition, understanding that terror could be molded and deployed as effectively as armies or laws. From that day forward, The executioner became the queen's unspoken partner, a shadow-shaping behavior in a palace already saturated with anxiety. Courtiers knew that a single misstep could summon the executioner, yet few understood the nuance of timing. The queen and her son refined a system where the threat of death was often more effective than its enactment. A whispered rumor that a miscreant had been spared only to serve another purpose, perhaps forced labor, perhaps observation, kept nobles perpetually uneasy. Life was a commodity to be used strategically. Death, a tool to be wielded without emotion. Even the boy, ambitious and cunning, experimented. He ordered the execution of minor offenders, not for personal grievance, but as a test of how fear could be internalized and transmitted. The palace, already tense with whispered anxieties, grew into a theater where every glance, every hesitation, and every murmured conversation carried the weight of potential death. Guards, servants, and ministers alike walked carefully, knowing that misjudgment could be fatal. And yet, there was a deeper lesson the queen intended, that those who wielded authority must understand the limits of mercy, the precision of punishment, and the inevitability of consequence. Outside the palace, the queen's reputation spread like wildfire. Rumors of the executioner's efficiency reached distant provinces, deterring rebellion without a single troop movement. Governors who once questioned her decrees began compliance with careful ritualistic fervor, knowing that disobedience could be fatal. The queen's power became synonymous with the executioner's hand, swift, unerring, and invisible in its omnipresence. The boy observed all of this, internalizing not only technique, but also psychology. Fear, when systematically applied, could achieve compliance without resistance. By the time he assumed more independent command, the boy had learned to use the executioner as an extension of his own will. Death was no longer merely punitive. It was performative, political, and manipulative. Each act was choreographed to send messages that transcended the immediate moment, shaping behavior long after the victim was gone. Courtiers began referring to the executioner's hand as the ultimate arbiter, the silent enforcer of imperial decree, and the boy, still learning from his mother, refined a system where obedience, terror, and political control became inseparable. In the end, the queen's greatest innovation was not her son's cruelty, but the realization that power could be exercised as a theater of fear. And as the boy's understanding deepened, he became the embodiment of this lesson, a ruler whose dominion was reinforced not only by armies and decrees, but by the chilling inevitability of the executioner's hand, always ready, always watching, always exacting the ultimate price for disloyalty. The throne, carved from dark oak and draped in crimson velvet, had always symbolized power, but under the queen's reign it became a stage for terror, soaked in the blood of both family and foe. Every scar etched into its surface, every stain on the surrounding marble, was a silent testimony to a mother's unflinching ambition and a son's ruthless education. Courtiers whispered in the corridors about the strange resonance of violence that clung to the palace air, a suffocating aura that made even the most loyal advisors hesitant to breathe freely. The throne, once a symbol of legacy, now carried the weight of survival, an ever-present reminder that to sit there meant choosing between complicity and death. The queen's most difficult decision, one that had seared her conscience yet fortified her power, involved her own son. He had grown clever, calculating, and dangerously aware of his capabilities. Rumors of conspiracies reached her ears almost daily. Ministers who debated loyalty in hushed tones, soldiers who eyed the crown with a mix of respect and fear, and allies who measured their own survival against the boy's growing ambitions. In private moments, she witnessed him practicing speeches and plotting maneuvers, unaware that the one who had shaped his ruthless tendencies also controlled his fate. Every glance he threw her way was a silent challenge, every question a subtle test of her resolve. To maintain the crown, she realized that personal affection could not interfere with political necessity. The moment came quietly, almost imperceptibly. A faction within the court, emboldened by whispers of rebellion, conspired to use the boy as their figurehead. unaware that the queen had already anticipated their intentions. She weighed her options in a sleepless night, staring at the crown as though it were a living thing, demanding a price she was prepared to pay. Her son, unaware of the trap closing around him, performed morning rituals in the grand hall, his movements precise, his expression serene. Yet the palace was not peaceful. Every shadow could conceal an enemy. Every footstep could signal betrayal. She arranged a council meeting, ostensibly to discuss trade and governance, but the room was filled with observers who had been sworn to secrecy, trained to act at her command. When the hour arrived, the queen spoke with deliberate calm. Her voice, soft yet carrying the authority of an empire, directed her son to attend the ceremonial evaluation of palace officials. The boy entered the room, confident in his inherited authority, unaware that his every word and gesture had been anticipated, studied, and manipulated. Guards positioned themselves silently behind tapestries and columns, each prepared to act instantly on her command. The room itself, a symbol of opulence and power, was transformed into a theater of death, its walls echoing with the quiet tension of impending violence. The trap was executed with surgical precision. At a subtle signal, the queen's agents moved, surrounding her son and restricting his ability to resist. Shock rippled across his face, not fear, but disbelief, the expression of one who cannot comprehend the betrayal of blood. The queen, standing at a slight distance, observed his struggle with the detached calculation of a strategist, understanding that the act would forever alter the perception of power in her court. The executioner, concealed until the final moment, performed the grim duty, swift and methodical. Silence fell immediately afterward, punctuated only by the faint echo of movement in the chamber, and the low, suppressed sobs of witnesses too fearful to intervene. The blood on the throne was not merely physical, it was symbolic. It marked the transition from personal love to absolute authority, from family loyalty to political pragmatism. The queen, having eliminated her son, cemented her position in a manner that left no room for rivals, no ambiguity for allies. Messages spread rapidly through the empire. Disobedience, even from one's own kin, could meet with swift, unyielding consequence. The queen had transformed the palace into a crucible where ambition, fear, and power fused, forging a reign unchallenged and unforgettable. Yet, beneath the triumph, a shadow lingered. Guards whispered of the boy's last words, delivered not in accusation, but in astonished silence, a realization that the very hands that nurtured him had now removed him from the world. Courtiers pondered the queen's resolve, torn between admiration and horror. The throne, bathed in blood and marked by the weight of necessary cruelty, would forever carry the memory of her decisive, terrifying act, that survival and power often demand the ultimate sacrifice, even when it is one's own flesh and blood. The palace, once a place of grandeur and calculated splendor, had grown quieter, heavier with the weight of memory and guilt. The echoes of her son's execution lingered in corridors, not as sound, but as invisible pressure, pressing against the queen's mind every time she moved through her chambers. Courtiers avoided her gaze, some out of fear, others out of pity, unsure how to navigate the cold efficiency that had just claimed a child. Even the guards, loyal and disciplined, spoke in hushed tones of the boy's last expression, a mixture of disbelief and the faintest glimmer of understanding that the world cared more for power than affection. Every corner of the palace seemed infused with his absence, an invisible presence that neither time nor authority could erase. Sleep became a stranger. The queen found herself staring into the dark hours, haunted by the imagined cries of her son, replaying in infinite variations, each one sharper than the last. She reminded herself that the act had been necessary, that the throne demanded sacrifices more cruel than personal feeling, yet reasoning failed to still the shadows that moved behind her eyes. Faces of ministers and soldiers flashed in her mind, their loyalty cemented by fear of her decisiveness, yet no act of political control could erase the human cost. She wandered the halls in solitude, tracing the pathways where her son had once walked, a ghost among echoes, imagining conversations that would never occur, laughter that would never return. Even in triumph, she discovered the enduring weight of conscience. Advisors attempted to offer counsel, but every word reminded her of the gap between ruler and mother, between calculation and conscience. Ministers praised her courage, emphasizing the stability she had imposed, the potential rebellions averted by the ruthless precision of her decisions. Soldiers swore loyalty, recounting how her unyielding authority had prevented chaos, how the empire's borders were safe because one young life had been sacrificed to preserve thousands more. Yet each commendation, each token of allegiance, was a mirror reflecting the stark reality. She had destroyed what was most precious, and no political calculus could rewrite the grief that lingered. Whispers, subtle and insidious, began circulating among the palace staff. Not outright defiance, but the quiet speculation that power could exact a terrible price, that no crown was worth the complete erosion of humanity. Rumors hinted at servants who wept alone in hidden corners, mourning the boy who had been both heir and pawn, whose potential had been extinguished to secure a reign. Even those most hardened by palace intrigues began to question the morality of survival built upon such ruthless sacrifice. The Queen's court, once a theater of absolute control, became a landscape of tension and uneasy introspection, where loyalty was measured in silence and guilt. In private, the Queen wrestled with the memories that no audience could witness. She recalled his laughter, mischievous and sharp, the sparkle of curiosity that had once made her heart soften despite her ambitions. She remembered the moments when he had sought approval, when love had been possible in fleeting glimpses before ambition demanded its dominance. In those recollections, she saw both a sun and a warning. Power, even absolute, could never fully shield one from the consequences of moral compromise. The shadows of remorse crept into her strategies, into decisions previously guided solely by pragmatism. Every decree, every interaction with ministers and envoys carried a subtle tremor, a faint hesitation rooted in the awareness of what she had done. Yet she also recognized the paradox of authority. The very act that had secured her position, that had silenced rivals and established dominion over the empire, was the same act that ensured she could never forget the cost. The throne, once a symbol of ultimate power, now weighed with guilt as heavily as it had with authority. The court adjusted, whispering around her carefully, aware that while fear had preserved order, unease had taken root in every corner. Remorse, as invisible as it was potent, had become an unspoken member of the council, a shadow companion to every step she took, a reminder that even absolute power demands its victims, often closest to the heart. In these long, solitary hours, the Queen began to understand the enduring truth of her reign. The price of survival was never simply political, and the echoes of her son's death would shape her rule, her court, and the very empire she fought to maintain. The shadow of remorse, unyielding and permanent, had claimed its throne alongside hers. The corridors of the palace echoed differently now. Silence had taken on a weight of its own, but it was not the quiet of peace. It was the quiet of fear, of resignation, of men who had once stood with pride and purpose, now reduced to shadows of themselves. The execution of the young heir had not only haunted the Queen, but had shattered the men who surrounded her, those charged with upholding law, loyalty, and honor. Generals, ministers, and advisors walked with a subtle stiffness, their eyes flicking to the throne as if it were a predator capable of devouring them should they falter. Every whispered consultation, every hesitant suggestion, was measured against the memory of what the Queen had done. The court was no longer a place of counsel. It had become a theater of obedience, where fear and memory dictated every action. These men had once been champions of empire, trained in the arts of strategy and rhetoric, proud of their intellect and valor. Yet in the shadow of her son's death, they became instruments, hollowed out by the stark demonstration of power. A general who had led legions across harsh landscapes now trembled while reading dispatches in the council chamber, acutely aware that a single misstep could be lethal. Ministers debated quietly, their arguments laced with caution, often abandoning bold ideas before they fully formed, fearing the invisible weight of reprisal. The queen had not only secured loyalty through fear, but had instilled in these men an intimate understanding of how fragile their positions had become. Their authority, once measured in titles and achievements, was now measured by the degree of compliance and the absence of dissent. Whispers traveled faster than formal decrees. The court's atmosphere was thick with suspicion. Every man and woman, no matter their rank, wondered who might be next to fall out of favor. Some tried to shield themselves by performing loyalty with an almost theatrical precision, nodding at every command, smiling at every jest. Yet even this could not entirely mask the trembling beneath. Others withdrew into private quarters, quietly mourning the loss of a boy whose life had become an emblem of both innocence and political necessity. Even the most hardened courtiers, who had witnessed countless betrayals and executions over decades, confessed privately that they had never seen fear so absolute, so personalized, so inescapable. The queen, for her part, observed these men with a careful eye, aware that absolute control often relied less on punishment and more on the perception of power. She noted which ministers flinched when reminded of past sacrifices, which generals avoided her gaze, which advisors whispered in corners. The lesson was clear. A court broken by fear was far easier to direct than one held together by loyalty. And yet, even as she manipulated these fractures, she felt the undercurrent of fragility. A single coalition of despairing men, united by memory and resentment, could unravel the careful order she had imposed. The queen understood that power secured through terror was both potent and perilous, for it created not blind obedience, but silent plotting. Among the broken men were those whose moral compass had been shattered more completely. Officers who once prided themselves on justice now rationalized their complicity, convincing themselves that survival required complicity in acts they had previously condemned. Advisors who had once been voices of reason found themselves strategizing how best to maintain favor while hiding their revulsion. Every gesture, every word, was filtered through the lens of personal preservation, creating a court where calculation replaced trust and self-interest replaced counsel. The palace, once a place of shared governance, had become a crucible of isolation and moral compromise. Even in the midst of control, the queen recognized the danger. Men broken by fear could still rise in secret, plotting vengeance against the childless throne she now held. And yet, she also understood that the trauma inflicted upon them, both by witnessing the execution and by living in the shadow of power, ensured that most would remain silent, cautious, compliant, if not loyal. The palace had become a garden of fractured wills, cultivated by fear and maintained by the queen's unyielding vigilance. The court of broken men had paradoxically become the strongest instrument of her enduring authority. But shadows of weakness and resentment lingered, subtle, patient, waiting for a misstep, for a sign that the queen's vigilance might waver. The court might be broken, but it was not dead, and every whispered sigh in the halls was a reminder that the throne, though secure today, demanded constant, merciless attention. The palace, once alive with ambition and ceremony, now seemed haunted not by spirits or curses, but by memory, by the echoes of those who had fallen, disappeared, or been discarded to preserve power. Every corridor, every chamber, carried the weight of past decisions, each step a reminder of the lives shattered by ambition. The queen walked through these halls with deliberate calm, her posture regal, her face a mask of serene authority. Yet the air around her vibrated with invisible tension. The ghosts of the throne were not ethereal. They were human, living reminders of what had been sacrificed, what had been broken, and what could still threaten her reign. The first of these ghosts were the young advisors who had survived the execution of her son. They moved cautiously, their eyes flicking toward every portrait, every gilded railing, as though expecting to see a warning etched into the walls. Their skills, once sharp and confident, had been dulled by the constant calculation of self-preservation. Every word spoken in council chambers was measured against memory, every suggestion filtered through fear. They had seen the queen act with ruthless precision, had watched her sacrifice bloodline for security, and they carried that knowledge like a silent blade behind their ribs. It was impossible to tell who plotted quietly, who simply endured, and who had already decided the cost of resistance. The palace had become a web of silent observers, each haunted by the knowledge that power and death were intertwined. Then there were the servants and guards, many of whom had been forced into complicity, tasked with enacting or witnessing acts that violated both law and conscience. Some had been present the night the boy had been executed, others had cleaned up after the rituals that followed, and all carried the psychological scars in invisible ways. Their loyalty was functional, their obedience born not of respect, but of fear. Yet even in the shadows of service, their minds held memories that could not be erased. The palace, despite its opulent walls and gilded ceilings, had become a mausoleum of human conscience, filled with the unspoken remorse and silent terror of those who had served. The queen herself was haunted, though she did not admit it, not even to herself. Each time she sat upon the throne, the weight of the past pressed down upon her. She had secured her position, yes, but at a cost that could never be reconciled. The life of her own child, the lives of those who might have acted differently, the fractured minds of the court, the moral decay she had overseen. These ghosts were not punishers. They were witnesses, silent, persistent, relentless in their reminder that power demanded sacrifice, and that the sacrifices sometimes reflected more on the survivor than on the fallen. Visitors to the palace, whether envoys from neighboring realms or merchants seeking favor, reported an odd atmosphere, a subtle chill in the air. They remarked upon a tension that seemed to seep from the walls, a sense of eyes watching them even when no one appeared present. The ghosts of the throne were not bound to the living. They lingered in memory, in atmosphere, in the quiet creak of floorboards and the soft rustle of curtains. Every action in the court was tempered by history, every decision shadowed by the consequences of ruthless pragmatism. Even as the queen maintained control, she could not entirely exorcise these phantoms. The surviving men and women of the court whispered, not openly, but in subtle signals, in careful glances, in gestures that revealed thought without words. They were reminders that the throne, though secured by blood and cunning, remained vulnerable to the collective memory of those who had witnessed its dark rise. Each day, the ghosts grew stronger, fed by the anxiety of the living and the weight of past sins. The palace, splendid in appearance, was a prison not just for those who dwelled within it, but for the spirit of governance itself. In this chamber of shadows, the queen ruled. Her authority was absolute, her strategies flawless, her control meticulous. And yet, every step she took, every decree she issued, was haunted by the presence of those who could no longer speak, yet whose existence demanded recognition. The ghosts of the throne were patient, and they reminded all who dared to sit upon it that the past could never truly be buried, that every crown was forged not just from gold, but from sorrow, fear, and memory. In the end, the throne was hers, but the ghosts would always remain, observing, waiting, whispering silently in the spaces between power and conscience. The throne, once the apex of ambition, now teetered between permanence and collapse. The queen, who had orchestrated a web of betrayal, manipulation, and even filicide to secure her reign, faced the ultimate question: would her power solidify, or would the same forces she had harnessed to rise now unravel everything she had fought to control? Each decision, each decree, was no longer a demonstration of strength, but a precarious test of survival. Allies could be relied upon only in calculation. Loyalty could be measured only in fear, and every action carried the invisible weight of the consequences that had already claimed so many lives. The court, once a theater of obedience, had become a labyrinth of suspicion. Ministers and generals who had once served with unquestioning zeal now watched each other as if every gesture contained treachery. The queen's most loyal confidants had survived years of political carnage, yet the memory of her ruthless pragmatism, her willingness to eliminate anyone who threatened her position, even her own son, hung over them like a specter. Every whispered conversation, every subtle glance, became a battlefield in which survival was the only prize. She understood this instinctively. Power, she had learned, was never static. It demanded constant reinforcement, vigilance, and when necessary, terror. Meanwhile, the populace murmured in ways the palace walls could not fully contain. Rumors traveled like wildfire through streets and markets: the death of the prince, the queen's rumored machinations, the mysterious disappearances of nobles. Some viewed her with awe, a ruler capable of unflinching action to preserve the kingdom. Others whispered curses beneath their breath, questioning whether a throne built on the blood of one's own child could endure. Yet fear, combined with calculated propaganda, kept public dissent from erupting. The queen ensured that messages of loyalty, divine favor, and prosperity were always louder than the murmurs of outrage, maintaining a delicate equilibrium between admiration and terror. The generals were another variable entirely. The army, having witnessed the removal of the prince, understood the queen's capacity for ruthless decisiveness. Some marveled at her courage. Others feared the implications for themselves. Each commander had to weigh obedience against ambition, survival against the potential for revolt. Their loyalty was transactional, contingent upon reward, recognition, and the perceived impossibility of replacing the queen. A single misstep, a misinterpreted order, a hesitant display of initiative could tip the scales from calculated obedience into rebellion. In this climate, even the strongest leaders acted with the caution of men walking a narrow ledge over a pit of vipers. The queen herself faced an internal reckoning. Every triumph, every consolidation of power, was shadowed by the memory of her son's death, an act that had secured her crown yet left an indelible mark upon her conscience. The weight of that decision was constant, though rarely acknowledged. She could not undo what had been done. She could only adapt, strategize, and continue weaving the tapestry of authority in which every thread was under her control. Yet she knew that absolute control was an illusion. Even the most meticulously planned regimes were vulnerable to the unpredictable currents of human ambition, emotion, and chance. In the final weeks of this critical juncture, the queen moved decisively. She enacted reforms that centralized power further in her hands, dismantling potential rival factions and rewarding those whose loyalty was unwavering. Public works projects displayed her benevolence, while secret tribunals punished even the faintest signs of disloyalty. Her enemies learned that resistance was futile. Her allies discovered that unwavering obedience could yield unexpected rewards, and the court itself became a mirror of her calculated will. Every element of governance, from taxation to ceremonial protocol, was meticulously aligned to reinforce her authority. By the close of this period, the question of fall or consolidation had reached its answer, at least for the moment. The throne, still warm from the blood of past sacrifices, now bore the imprint of a ruler who had proven capable of wielding both fear and strategy with precision. The queen had not only survived the most dangerous opposition within her family, within her court, and within the very population she governed, but had transformed potential chaos into structured dominance. Yet history whispers its eternal warning. Power consolidated through cruelty and calculated ruthlessness is fragile, even at its apparent peak. The ghosts of the throne remain patient, waiting for the slightest lapse, the softest miscalculation. For now, the queen sat unmoved, the embodiment of authority and survival, aware that the empire's present stability rested on a knife's edge, balanced between the lessons of blood and the peril of ambition unchecked. The queen's reign did not end with a single act of violence, nor with a quiet removal of her enemies. It lingered in every shadow of the court, in the tremble of servants who knew which whispers could cost them life, and in the hollowed eyes of children who had watched their parents fall. The blood spilled to secure the throne became more than ink on history's pages. It became the very air the court breathed, a lingering, suffocating reminder that power demanded both sacrifice and submission. Every chamber, every corridor, every ceremonial hall carried echoes of cruelty, meticulously orchestrated, lessons in fear disguised as loyalty, and obedience enforced by memory of what had been lost. Survivors of her court became unwilling carriers of this knowledge. Courtiers, generals, and ministers had learned the ways of survival beneath a ruler whose cunning rivaled her ruthlessness. They carried her methods forward in hushed conversations and private teachings, instructing the next generation in reading the dangerous subtlety of power, in interpreting loyalty and betrayal through a single glance, in using fear as a tool as sharp and precise as any sword. The queen had transformed cruelty into instruction, leaving behind a legacy as much psychological as political, a blueprint for domination that would outlast her own life. Yet the human cost of her ambition was impossible to erase. Families shattered, heirs lost to suspicion or execution, servants who had vanished under the guise of duty. These were the invisible casualties of her reign. Some withdrew into isolation, haunted by guilt or grief, attempting to preserve whatever fragments of humanity the palace's cruelty had spared. Others, hardened and embittered, carried lessons of survival into new corridors of power, either to prevent repetition of such horrors, or in the darker cases, to replicate them. The queen had demonstrated that the machinery of terror could be wielded with purpose, and history had a cruel way of repeating what it had learned. Even the queen herself, older now, carried her legacy as both armor and burden. She walked the palace halls with the confidence of one who had stared death, betrayal, and filial sacrifice in the face and survived. Yet she bore invisible scars no crown could conceal. Sleep came only in brief, fragmented hours, haunted by visions of her son, whose life she had ended to secure her throne. Sometimes she imagined what might have been, had he lived, had the crown been shared, had mercy tempered ambition. But such thoughts were dangerous. Power demanded payment, and her conscience knew it. Even a ruler capable of calculating murder could not escape the weight of what she had done. Beyond the palace walls, the kingdom bore the imprint of her reign. Political factions, once vibrant with ambition, were fractured and subdued. Families became cautious, teaching children the art of subservience masked as boldness. Soldiers and administrators learned that loyalty was conditional, and survival often meant compromise. Every law, every decree, every ceremony reinforced the lessons she had imparted. Crossed the queen, and the consequences were precise, swift, and public. Her mastery of terror as governance reshaped the entire state apparatus. Chroniclers recorded her reign with a mixture of awe and horror. They catalogued her brilliance and cruelty, yet no record could fully capture the human suffering beneath the polish of protocol and ceremony. Diaries, letters, and oral histories preserved moments of terror unseen by public eyes. Trembling servants, broken families, children scarred by witnessing the execution of those they loved. These fragments revealed the unseen weight of a throne built on fear and the lasting imprint of calculated cruelty on every life it touched. Ultimately, her legacy was dual: the consolidation of power through intelligence and strategy, and the moral toll exacted on those who survived. Her reign demonstrated that absolute authority required sacrifices even the most sacred, and that these sacrifices left indelible scars that would echo across generations. The crown she had secured was unshakable, but it was also a symbol of fear, a seat built on human suffering, a reminder that power without restraint is a double-edged sword. The queen's blood-stained legacy became legend, but not myth. It was living, a presence that shaped every future ruler who considered the crown and every family that whispered about her reign behind closed doors. Power, she had shown, demanded both cunning and ruthlessness, but it left a mark far beyond the walls of the palace. An eternal lesson that the pursuit of survival and dominance carries a cost measured not in years, but in lives.